Hi, we're going to look at Jackson's Bank War today here. And remember, keep studying, study a little bit for the AP exam, and it will help you out quite a bit as we get closer and closer to that day in May here. So, Andrew Jackson's Bank War. Remember, the first national bank was chartered for 20 years. Alexander Hamilton was a big proponent of it in 1791. Jefferson and Madison opposed it and were able to use their political powers to not get it the charter renewed. But then the War of 1812 happens, and Madison starts to regret and think, maybe the economy was better off with a national bank. And so the second national bank gets started in, as you can see here, 1816, just after the War of 1812, on another 20-year charter. And this 20-year charter will also not get renewed. Although Henry Clay is going to try to get it renewed, it does not get renewed. So the Second National Bank is only around for 20 years. In fact, you can still see the building in Philadelphia, not far from where the Liberty Bell is currently on display. So the second bank of the United States, the National Bank. When you hear people talk about the National Bank, they're talking about the first Bank of the United States or the second Bank of the United States. So, and I might accidentally just call it the National Bank here because that's what it's often commonly referred to as. But Henry Clay was a big supporter of it. He saw it and by the fact that by the time Andrew Jackson was president, it was point blank the most important financial institution in the entire country. It was big with loans and a variety of things and economic policy for the country. Did a lot of things. It made a lot of Henry Clay's ideas, like the American system, more possible for developing and loans and things like that. That he wanted to be doing, and it allowed the government's economic abilities to be more flexible. However, Andrew Jackson opposed it. He said, no, number one, it's unfair competition. You have this national bank as more power than the state banks, more power than the local banks, more power than city banks and private banks. And therefore, it's just unconstitutional because there's this unfair competitive advantage that it has over all the other banks. And of course, Andrew Jackson, being at heart, a guy who, likes strong state governments, although not as we saw in the previous review with the Tariff of Abominations, but he does like the principle of states' rights. Although you could quite argue, as president, he did the opposite and strengthened the national government. But so he sees this unfair competition to the smaller banks. Number two, it's not expressly written in the Constitution. He's what you call a strict constructionist. You have that necessary and proper clause. Some people call it the elastic clause, which says that the federal government can do things that aren't expressly written in the Constitution if it helps them accomplish something that is expressly written in the Constitution. And so people who like to be loose constructionists, who like to read this loosely so they can expand the federal government's power, so they can do more than what the national government is technically expressly told they can do in the Constitution. Like people like Hamilton like this because it allows them to create the bank. The Constitution doesn't say you can have a national bank, but it does say that you can do various economic things and regulate currency and etc. So people like Hamilton and Henry Clay would argue, well, then we have the right to have a national bank because it allows us to do these things. Andrew Jackson saying, no, it's not expressly written in the Constitution, therefore you can't do it. He's being a strict constructionist, not a loose constructionist. And the third reason Andrew Jackson opposes it is it encourages speculation. It encourages more people to buy. There's more money going into things. And speculation is loose investments, risky investments, foolish investments, investments following trends and hot trends. And he says this creates panics, these depressions and recessions, including the Panic of 1819, in which Andrew Jackson himself lost much of his money in. Panic of 1819. Basically, they got more conservative, and they said this. They asked the Second National Bank to call in a lot of its loans from state banks and local banks. They had given out loans to various banks, and then they had in turn to recall in loans. And basically, a lot of people weren't able to pay back their loans. A lot of the loans that were given out at that time. Like when I bought my house, you know, I did a 15-year mortgage, and basically with Fifth Third, and basically I have to pay, you know, X amount of dollars per month every month for 15 years, and then it's all done and taken care of. And Fifth Third can't come to me and say, you know, we want the whole thing paid for now. And I'm like, well, I had 15 years. You know, I have a 15-year loan. I pay once every month. And Fifth Third can't demand the full payment in full. They can only demand the small monthly payment for 15 years. However, a lot of the loans back then were designed, you know, where the banks could call for their to be paid back in full early. And so the National Bank called in loans from other banks, and you had a lot of these wildcat banks, which were, you know, very, very loose, small banks that were dealing in lots of speculation. It forced a lot of people off land who had already paid part of the loan back, but couldn't afford to pay it all off when the loans were getting called into the National Bank. And so a lot of people got forced off lands, lost money. Some people went even into prison for their debts. Andrew Jackson was very, very upset about the Panic of 1819, but it was just poor policy by people who actually kind of opposed the banks, the Second National Bank, who then forced this policy upon it. But anyways, the fourth reason Andrew Jackson opposes the National Bank is he says it oppresses the poor. The poor get these loans, and then they're charged interest, you know, and they end up paying a lot of fees over the course of paying back the loan. And who does benefits from these interest in these fees? The rich. And so the rich are getting richer off the backs of the poor. So he opposes the National Bank. He opposes big banks in large part because he's saying it's oppressing the poor and making the rich richer. Andrew Jackson, remember, frames himself as a man of the common people, the common man. You know, so in 1832 it becomes an election issue. It becomes an election issue even though it's not set to expire in 1836, and most people are expecting the fight for the rechartering to happen until 1836, because Henry Clay wants to make it an issue early. He wants to bring up the issue 4 years early so that he can make it a campaign issue, so that he can run as, I'm the guy who's going to keep the National Bank. Andrew Jackson won't renew it, so you have to vote for me now because I will be the one renewing it, knowing that Jackson will veto it. So Henry Clay gets it passed through Congress, and of course Andrew Jackson vetoes it down. And so it is a campaign issue. Biddle, who's in charge of the Second National Bank here, he joins Henry Clay and is politicking on behalf of Henry Clay. And it makes sense, you know, if Andrew Jackson doesn't think the Second National Bank here has the right to exist, that's Biddle's livelihood. He believes in the bank as well. And so he wants to see it renewed. So he throws political support while running the Second National Bank behind Henry Clay. And Andrew Jackson's enraged. He says, you know, he tells Martin Van Buren, he says, you know, the bank is trying to kill me, but I'm going to kill it. You know, it's very personal to him. And so Jackson wins the election. Remember, you get this universal white manhood suffrage, where more and more white men are able to vote during this age of Jackson, the Jacksonian era. Remember, for a long time, a lot of states said in order to be able to vote, you had to own a certain amount of land, or or etc. And so for a long time, a lot of white men weren't allowed to vote. Suffrage has been a gradual process of inclusion. And so Andrew Jackson wins in large part from a lot of the growing amount of white men who can vote, because many of these new white men who can vote are poor and also share concerns and fears with the National Bank and believe that it is oppressing the poor and making the rich richer. So Jackson coasts into victory, routs Henry Clay in the election, beats Henry Clay, who was running for president, and after Jackson's victory, he withdraws the money from the Second National Bank, puts it into state banks, puts it into local banks, to kind of weaken the National Bank in its final 4 years here, knowing it's not going to get recharted because of his opposition. And then he also passes the specie circular, which basically says, to buy land out west and so forth, you need to pay for it with precious metals and gold or silver, hard currency, the silver, gold, coins. And this actually ends up hurting the little guy. Andrew Jackson does this to help the little guy. Remember, he's the he's the guy who supports the common man. However, you look at it like this. does the common man have a lot of gold and silver laying around? No. And if you can only purchase land through gold and silver, and he thinks this is going to make the price of land not go up and down drastically, which he says, you know, hurts the little guy and allows a lot of the rich people to make profits off of it. However, if you have to buy land with hard currency, and the rich have that hard currency, it's not that hard to see that hard currency, gold and silver, is going to be more in demand, and that the banks and the rich people aren't going to part with their gold and silver except at higher premium prices. And so it actually makes it harder for the poor people to actually, and middle class people to actually buy land. So here's Jackson's bank war. And many people think that the bank war ends up hurting the economy, and you'll see that later on in Martin Van Buren's presidency, who's the successor, the hand-picked successor to Andrew Jackson. Thank you.